I'm a history teacher, and I can tell you that teenagers, it's hard for teenagers to understand our recent history. What's more, in the Waldensian Church, there are different approaches to recent history. So we can't say that there's an official Waldensian version. 100 years after the first Waldensian migrants came to Uruguay and Argentina, they had been assimilated into local culture. Although Waldensians still talked about their heritage, faith, and traditions, they considered themselves members of a South American culture. They did not forget their roots, but they felt strongly committed with social customs, political affairs, and social life. In some aspects, we could say that between the 19th and the 20th century, this region became a kind of melting pot, where the former colonial society was transformed by the impact of massive emigration. For example, between 1860 and 1913, Uruguay and Argentina received thousands of immigrants from different regions of Italy, France, Spain, Switzerland, England, Germany, and after that, many others came from the Slavic countries: Lithuania, Syria, Lebanon, Russia, Romania, Austria-Hungary, and also Jews from Palestine, Turkey, and North Africa. In Argentina and Uruguay, some state policies tried to blend the different cultures and shape the idea of a national identity. So although these identities did not completely melt and fade, we could say that during the 50s, the idea of a Uruguayan and Argentinian culture was established. In both countries, local intellectuals, politicians, and artists gradually stopped looking at Europe with that 19th century fascination and focused on the region. They tried to determine our identity. They tried to depict the local customs and its people. In the field of plastic arts, for example, the Uruguayan Pedro Figari tried to capture the everyday life, representing local customs, the countryside, and the city with an unrealistic paint stroke. Although his painting shows some nostalgia towards traditional life, he was representing patterns that are not anymore European. In his paintings, you can see candombe, that is a traditional Afro-American music parade. This is an example of a kind of candombe. He also depicted wonderful plains where horses graze under a hypnotizing moon, where people dance in the street in other paintings, or fancy meetings of high society, backyards of colonial houses depicted also in a childish fashion. Many intellectuals and artists would say that Pedro Figari would paint like a child, that he was too childish and naive, but it was a style, and it was a Uruguayan style. Pedro Figari, realized that Uruguay was changing fast and that modernization was irreversible, but somehow he wanted to immortalize the essence and core of our culture. And that's a very important stage of our history and as Argentinians and Uruguayan people, because these painters realized that we have a new, different culture from European culture. In Argentina also, things were changing rapidly. The immigration, the growing industries, the internal exodus from the countryside to the cities, and the vigor of the trade unions have changed the face of the country. Cities like Buenos Aires and Rosario looked like industrial monsters, growing faster and faster, swallowing little towns and villages as they expand. In the 30s, the Italian descendant artist Antonio Berni designs some paintings that describe that new scenario. In Manifestación, that will be demonstration, Berni shows a crowd walking along the street, claiming for bread and work. These workers don't look enraged, but tired and wasted. Their faces are so close to our sides that we can notice the deep wrinkles, the sad glances and shadowy facial features. You can see in the crowd the Afro-American ancestry, the Mediterranean cultures, and the South American natives. In another painting called Chacareros, that would be small farmers, Berni recalls a small farmers and ranchers uprising. In that painting, we see again the same kind of expressions. Peasants there look tired, concerned, perhaps fed up with a sequel of bad crops or low selling prices. It looks like a photograph taken 30 minutes before an outburst. The man on his horse right there, the woman holding a stick here, and all the evasive glances suggest the idea that something bad is about to happen. These paintings are a good example of social realism in Argentina. They represent the state of uncertainty that followed the Big Depression, which also affected the Waldensian colonies. Following the Big Depression, the 40s and 50s are a time of splendor and optimism. The Argentinian and Uruguayan economies are booming again, and politicians promote big welfare states. During the 50s, the traditional society practically disappears. So the world that imagined Pedro Figari is no longer existing, while working and middle classes expand. Most Waldensians were part of that middle class. In the countryside, for example, where the big ranches and large fields are common, Waldensians represent an exceptional group of small landowners and tenant farmers. They exploit several fields and dairy farms, and there are also some modest cattle ranchers, cheesemakers, small fruit producers, grain millers, and shopkeepers. My grandfather, for example, was a cheesemaker back in the 50s. In cities, Waldensians are part of a much more diversified middle class. Industrial workers and public employees, university students and Waldensian magistrates, Waldensian scholars and Waldensian primary school teachers. Regarding professionals, and this is the answer to a question you made a few minutes ago. Regarding professionals, Waldensian women were pioneers in some fields. The daughters of Reverend Daniel Armando Gon and Alice Reward represent a curious case. They were physicians, chemists, teachers. Their mother, Alice, had studied in Torre Pellice and always gave them an encouraging example. Unfortunately, there are very few investigations concerning the role of Waldensian women during the 20th century. But we can say that in both countries, many of them gradually managed to overcome the culturally prescribed roles and moved to the cities. They became professionals and even serve as pastors. In a 2016 thesis investigation, Aymara Pais, she was a theology student, states that in the South American Waldensian church, women were assuming pastoral roles since the mid-20th century. Although the ministry was not officially recognized yet, they were women like Inés Rostan, Berta Barolin, Violeta Geimonat, and Gladys Bertinat had the same duties that pastors had, but they were called church assistants. Even though, since 1963, women were allowed to be ordained. But the topic was still a controversy. And only in 1979, the first woman becomes officially pastor in our church. Her name is Gladys Bertinat. She still lives in Colonia Valdense, and after her, many women accessed that ministry. But let us go back to the 60s. As we have said, during the 50s, Uruguayan and Argentinian societies had developed a strong urban and middle-class culture, of which Waldensians were part. They feel committed with a national or even regional identity, and they share a growing concern for political and social matters. But during the 60s, the continental panorama turns upside down, creating a thrilling scenario. In world history, the 60s is an extremely controversial decade. When I studied to become a teacher, I found out that there were some particular world events related to the 60s that are essential to understand what happened in my region. Those events must be considered a historical landmark for South America, not only because they had a great influence over the regional economy and the political and social movements, but also because they forged and boosted the development of a new theology, a new Latin American theology. First of all, the civil rights movement in the United States and the French mass protests of May 1968 showed young people in South America that they could also stand up against what they considered unfair. Along the 60s, Argentina and Uruguay became the scenario of demonstrations organized by students and trade unions. In the beginning, demonstrations had different mottos, mostly related with political issues. But when the economic crisis burst again in the 60s, people began to claim harder against the inflationary process, the unemployment rates, the widespread pauperization process, the low salaries, or the miserable budget for the university. These demonstrations, sooner or later, had bloody consequences, especially when the police began to repress the protesters. And that fueled a spiral of violence. Secondly, we all know that for centuries in Latin America, the Roman Catholic Church was a traditional and very powerful authority. So when in 1959, Pope John XXIII announces his plans to summon a new council, many intellectuals, clergymen, and also Protestant theologians react with eagerness and expectancy. In the middle of a tense world scenario, people in South America received the news from the Vatican with hope. In Latin America, the Council contributed to recreate an atmosphere of confidence and hope. It led to a more fluent economical dialogue, and people debated about the role of the Church in a time of change. So in 1967, the encyclical Populorum Progressio inflamed those debates, and the discussions and papers emphasized the need of a prophetic voice and a Christian commitment towards the suffering people. In that state of effervescence, Latin American Catholic bishops met in Medellin, Colombia. So between August and September 1968, the Second Episcopal Conference is held, and that event is considered a landmark. Clearly, Roman Catholicism in Latin America was splitting into two different tendencies. And the 1968 conference takes distance from the most conservative and traditional positions. Bishops debated about the need to understand and analyze the signs of the times, as they say, and they showed deep concern for the suffering Latin American people. They wanted to build a pastoral sensitivity towards injustice, committed to an internal church conversion. As they said, they wanted an authentically poor church. They sounded like Waldensians, although they didn't realize that. A shift in Protestant theology. This photo is FET, Facultad Evangélica de Teología in Buenos Aires, back in the 50s. And I couldn't recognize many faces, but I know that she's Berta Barolin. She was a church assistant, a pastor, not recognized as a pastor, but she was a pastor in the 50s. Meanwhile, Protestants were also going through a time of effervescence and debate. During the first half of the century, Valdensians had been in touch with a North American theological movement known as social gospel. It had appeared at the end of the 19th century, and influenced by Walter Rauschenbusch, the movement tried to focus on social problems and to analyze them from an ethical perspective. During a time of extreme individualism, that movement was a slap in the face of many Protestant churches which were not committed with social issues. Rauschenbusch centered his theology in the concept of the kingdom of God, and he claimed that Christians were called to help solving social issues. According to him, faith should be expressed through social commitment. The movement arrived to South America during the 20th century, and it is well received in Buenos Aires by scholars and theology students. Despite its critics to working conditions, poverty, and life in the slums, the movement stated that things could change and the kingdom of heaven could be exhibited through Christians' hard work. That was an ethical movement with overflowing optimism. But all that optimism would crumble by the mid-20th century. In Buenos Aires, students who attended courses on the Evangelical Theological faculty felt astonished and puzzled when they heard the news from the Second World War. The kingdom of God, the social righteousness, and all beliefs concerning peace and the idea of a world in progress collapsed. It was hard to foresee in that time the future of theological thinking after the genocides committed in Auschwitz or Treblinka. It was also hard to believe in humankind after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But when the writings of Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer arrived to the region, scholars and students discovered a new theology. Now Protestants in Latin America would focus on Christian responsibility in times of hardships and social mobilization, violence and authoritarianism. For many Waldensians, Karl Barth's work was a great discovery, and the book Christian Community and Civil Community, that is Christengemeinde und Bürgergemeinde, translated to Spanish in 1967, that book was a success. There's one more thing that I can say to show you how important that book for Waldensians and Methodists in Rio de la Plata was. That pocket-sized version was published in 1967. It was translated by Elizabeth Lindenberg, and its prologue was written by Emilio Castro. Elizabeth was married to Carlos del Monte, a Waldensian pastor, who was interested in Barth's work. And Emilio Castro was a Methodist pastor in Uruguay who had attended the lectures of Karl Barth in Basel. And he was also committed to social rights issues. Since then, since the book was published, it will be on every pastor's desk. But why was that book so successful? Simple. Although Karl Barth had written it with the Second World War as his background, Methodists and Waldensians were reading it in a context of political effervescence, violence, and authoritarianism. In fact, the late 60s were a very difficult time, and Barth's writing was helping them to understand their present. For example, in 1967, many students' demonstrations ended with disturbance and violent repression. What's more, in Uruguay, people were reporting the use of torture as a method to obtain information during the police investigations. That year, the Waldensian bulletin Renacimiento mentions the matter, sharing a meditation written by Reverend Carlos del Monte. That short text was titled, "The Church is Responsible." And there, Del Monte blends Karl Barth's argument with the current news. So, I'm quoting Carlos Del Monte. He says, "In a human society, God has instituted the state and all its organs to secure every citizen's life. For that reason, police have the honorable task of preventing the society from falling into anarchy. It is their duty to ensure our safety. That is the cause of their existence, and it is an essential basic duty. But what happens when the police doesn't offer guarantees of any kind regarding their respect towards any citizens? What happens when they employ the force indiscriminately to repress some expressions that they deliberately consider punishable?" In this article, Del Monte brings with him Barth's theological thinking, in particular an interpretation of the Epistle to the Romans, chapter 13, related to the duties of the civil authorities. Del Monte follows Barth when he says that the state and all its organs were created to serve and ensure life. And he recognizes that police force must guarantee safety within the borders of a country. But he says that the state loses legitimacy and support when it threatens life, because human integrity is supposed to be protected. This Valdensian pastor was basing his arguments against violence and authoritarianism on Karl Barth's work. Following the epistle to the Romans, he claimed that the state should be committed to human life and not to violence against those who claim for social justice. From Del Monte's point of view, that kind of repression was unbearable. Not only because it threatened human life, but also because it was being used in favor of the powerful and wealthy groups of society. Furthermore, he said that when the state repressed indiscriminately and harmed human life, it was eroding its own foundations. So if we analyze this statement from our present, we can say that Del Monte's words were somehow prophetical, and that he was perhaps unconsciously anticipating a time of hardness. During the 60s, the ecumenical dialogue also was very fruitful. In 1961, a movement called Church and Society in Latin America had been constituted. It was an ecumenical movement that promoted a theological renovation in Protestant churches and was very influential in Argentina and Uruguay. Many Methodists and Waldensians were active members of it, and they contributed with articles to its main journal called Christianity and Society. And that journal arrived to every single country in South America and also to the United States. In our region, Methodist pastors were deeply committed to urban social issues, and they joined forces with Waldensians to develop a more autochthonous theology. This theological shift was conducted mostly through the Church and Society movement, where they got in touch with the liberal tendencies of the Roman Catholic Church. The movement was wondering about its mission. They aimed to respond theologically and serve in a conflicting historical moment. So we must say that Church and Society was not just a bunch of students who wanted to put into practice a few half-baked ideas. It was an ecumenical movement, culturally situated within the Latin American horizons, which wanted to build up a new theology to respond to Latin American problems, trying to understand the present through the Bible and with the help of social sciences. They were building Protestant Latin American hermeneutics. So, liberation theology was being built simultaneously in the Roman Catholic and the Protestant fields. Although the contribution of Roman Catholic priests to this theological thinking is priceless, we shouldn't forget the cultural background that the Church and Society movement and Protestants created in South America. That journal arrived to most Latin American countries, spreading the ideas of prominent theologians. So we can say now that during the 60s and 70s, many Roman Catholics and Protestants were trying to build a theology based on their own cultural and social features. Instead of trying to understand the Latin American problems from an European point of view, they were creating a local theology to dialogue with their present. However, we must say that in the Rio de la Plata region, the Valdensian Church was not a homogeneous and solid body where all members shared the same theological thinking. In fact, the polarization that took place in our society during the 60s and 70s also leaked into the Valdensian communities. For example, in 1968, one Valdensian middle-aged woman writes to Mensajero Valdense, that was the journal of the Valdensian Church, to complain about the tendencies of some articles. She was raised in a Valdensian colony, and she finds it hard to understand that Valdensian students who live in the city showed such radical ideas. So she says, the official journal of our church had always been a friend who twice a month visited us bringing helpful messages, which helped us in our daily life, stimulating our faith. Pastors and lay people who wrote in that journal helped us to understand better God's teachings. We received those journals with joy. But now it is the opposite. The first thing we see on it is a biblical text, but next to it there is always an article with far-fetched ideas, which creates an awkward situation. What is happening there, this woman says? Is it that in our whole church our pastors have been abducted by some foreign and dangerous ideas? I wanted to read this letter because I think it depicts well that rarefied atmosphere. That woman felt outraged. She could not understand that urban Waldensians and pastors wanted to discuss political matters in a religious journal. From her point of view, young people were creating, and I am quoting here, destruction, hate, violence, and dissent. And she had managed that they were being led by foreign ideas. A few months before that, a young man had written a very strange letter, which was also published in Mensajero Valdense. On it, this is the letter written by this man. On it, he stated with sarcasm that the journal should change its name to Waldensian Socialist Messenger. As you can see, things in the Waldensian church were not easy during those years. Finally, in 1973 and 1976, the coups d'etat in Uruguay and Argentina were followed by long dictatorships. In both countries, the Waldensian church was thoroughly controlled because the regimes considered many Waldensians to be supporters of communism. In Argentina, one Waldensian pastor was arrested and tortured during the military intervention to a high school. In 1974, the journal Mensajero Valdense had to close down, and its director was arrested and interrogated by the Uruguayan forces. Officially, the journal had been censored due to its connection with international Marxism, but the truth is that during the 70s, the slightest word of opposition would be silenced. For my graduate thesis, I had the opportunity to search through journals of the Waldensian Church, and I could also interview Waldensians who lived in Uruguay between 1967 and 1974. Many of them found it hard to talk about those years. They hesitated, they were reluctant to talk about certain things, or even they asked me to stop recording because they wanted to say something else in confidence. A few of them shared their memories cheerfully and afflicted because they were bringing to the present better and sad events. Some of them said that they had to cope with harassment, exile, police investigation, and censorship. Some of them lost their job, a friend or a relative who left the country. A few pastors were arrested, interrogated, or had to flee overnight, and most of them knew that they were being watched. Others carried on with their lives silently and cautiously, and many others supported the regime with explicit cooperation. But what was harder to talk about for them was not the systematic control and censorship that the regime set over the whole country. I was impressed when I realized that many traumatic memories were related to the misunderstandings, quarrels, and moral accusations that Waldensians endured in their own churches. For many Waldensians, for the first time in their lives and in their historic memory, harassment and censorship was not only coming from the outside, but from their peers. In that rarefied and polarized atmosphere, members of the same community were attacking and controlling each other, influenced by the terms of a political witch hunt. I collected some memories related to this time. For example, one pastor told me that during the 70s, two Waldensians used to attend the worship services and secretly tape record his sermons, taking them to the police station. For these pastors, this couple were brothers and informants at the same time, and it was hard for him to live with that. So during the 70s, Waldensians felt that the church was no longer a safe place. They could not express themselves as freely, and they should control their manners because they were being watched. However, by the end of the decade, things began to change, and Waldensians decided that they would not accept any longer the control of the regime. So in 1977, in the Synod, they decided to contravene some instructions related to the names of people who shall not be designated for any position, and they elected their church authorities freely. To clarify that decision, they stuck to the principle of separation between church and state, quoting also their intern ordinances. That statement was irrefutable, and the regime had to step back. Since then, Waldensians began to walk a long and sorrowful path of reconciliation. And nowadays, those memories are still being theologically elaborated. Let us jump to a map of the Waldensian church nowadays in South America. Nowadays, the Waldensian church in the Rio de la Plata region gathers about 25 local communities. If we take a look at the map, we could easily recognize three wide areas where the Waldensian churches are located. One up to the north that I couldn't even reach, and here in Uruguay, and to the south of Argentina. Firstly, we can find many churches in the northeastern Argentinian provinces of Santa Fe and Entre Rios. The region is traversed by the Paraná River, right here, and it has a humid and subtropical climate. There we will find dynamic agricultural colonies located near bigger towns where new Waldensian churches have developed. Since the beginning of this century, Waldensian students who had moved to Paraná and Santa Fe cities also started to gather in their houses, celebrating their faith with very simple but meaningful liturgies. They started meeting regularly in 2002, first as a youth group, and after a few years they found out that they were more than that. They realized that sharing their everyday concerns and celebrating faith, they were a real church. My wife Janina was part of that, and although she left Paraná City in 2012, we were strongly fond of that church. And we are proud to say that they are a real church, young, socially committed, interested in debating current issues from a theological perspective. Secondly, if we drive to the south and after 14 long hours ride by car, we will arrive to another region with a few Waldensian churches. There, the fertile pampas meet the windy and semi-arid plains. Waldensians settled during the beginning of the 20th century there. It might have been shocking for the first Waldensian settlers to arrive to those huge plains, spotted with shallow lakes and salt deposits. The agricultural colonies and the towns were linked by the railroad to Bahia Blanca, a big city with more than 300,000 inhabitants, where Waldensians founded a new church during the 50s. Then the Uruguayan west and southwestern coast, right here, is a third wide area where you can find several Waldensian churches. These communities are located in old agricultural colonies, in colonies that turned into small towns, in thriving towns and cities where Waldensians established new churches, and also in capital cities such as Colonia de Sacramento, where we live, Fariventos, or Paysandú. But if we turn to the map, we will see that Montevideo, right here, and Buenos Aires were far away from the original colonies. In Buenos Aires, for example, you can find two Waldensian churches, and in Montevideo you can find one Waldensian church founded by the mid-20th century. That Waldensian church has a strong ecumenical commitment, a home for students, and lodging facilities for people who travel to receive medical treatment. Well, When I was asked to write a presentation on the modern Waldensian church in Rio de la Plata, I was told to talk about its challenges and the current signs of hopefulness. I must say that I felt a little overwhelmed by that because it is hard to talk about such a wide range of churches. I am not trying to look humble by saying that I don't have the experience to answer that question, but I am just being sincere. For that reason, I asked some brothers and sisters from different communities to tell me the meaning of being Waldensian in the present times. So, what follows is not my testimony, but the words of other flesh and bone Waldensians. Most of the Waldensians who replied to my question answered that an important part of their identity is strongly related to what we call a Waldensian heritage. Okay, that's yesterday's news. But the interesting thing is that the idea of heritage, which some decades ago was linked to the pride of a common ancestry, nowadays is changing. For example, of all the people who answered, 5 out of 10 mentioned that they were not born in a home where being Waldensian was compulsory. In fact, some of them belonged to Roman Catholic or interdenominational families. Somehow, these people got in touch with the Waldensian church and decided to be part of it. By doing so, they became church members and they identified with its historical and cultural features. Ana Berreta, for example, is a woman, a middle-aged woman, right here, who was raised in a Roman Catholic family. And she married to a Waldensian man. But someday she decided to join the Waldensian church because she thought that they should give their kids a testimony of unity in faith. Jumping to Gabriel Gonet, who is, although his father was Waldensian, his mother was a devoted Roman Catholic who taught him about faith about and beyond any label. He feels identified with the Waldensian poverty as an ideal that encourages him to live on basic things, dismissing unnecessary comforts and technology, working the soil with his own hands, making things at home instead of buying them. A third case is that of Erika Velázquez Guerrero, a 34-year-old librarian and museologist who works in Centro Cultural Valdense in Colonia Valdense. She was raised in a small town and joined the Waldensian church since her childhood. Although a narrow-minded person would wonder what is a Velázquez doing in Centro Cultural Valdense, Erika would probably give her own testimony, and she would talk about Waldensian freedom, for example. Apparently, for these people, a Waldensian heritage is not in genetics, but in the choices they made. Another woman, called Febe Barorin, emphasizes that idea, saying that being Waldensian is a matter of choices. She is a middle-aged woman who lives in a Waldensian colony in Entre Rios, and she was raised in a 100% Waldensian family. Although she states that a Waldensian heritage is something we put into practice. And I'm quoting Febe Barorin here. For me, being Waldensian nowadays is a decision. It is also part of a tradition for many of us. I can deny the importance of my history, but I am convinced that I don't need to go back to the Waldensian valleys or to dress like a Piedmontese woman or to preserve the customs to feel like a real Waldensian. But there is one thing that I must remember always, that I have a deep history of faith, of resistance, of a strong conviction that makes me part of a church. That is the kind of history that will reflect into others, that will make them want to be part of a Waldensian church. I hope and I believe so. There are other testimonies that foresee a challenging but also encouraging future. Rocio J. Monat and Analia Long are two young students who have strong commitment with camps and educational ministries. They consider themselves as witnesses of a church where they could experience a real-life spirituality. That is, a faith that can be put into practice, that helps them in daily life, that walks with them. For both of them, every camp in Parque 17 de Febrero was an opportunity to learn about different ways to educate and feed the soul. In El Parque, campers are invited to be part of an experiential approach to Christian concepts, while leaders learn to plan a camp, to outline the aim of every activity, to evaluate. There, children and teenagers understand through experience the meaning of the kingdom, of social righteousness, of prophecy, of community values. It is a place where Christian beliefs can be assimilated through group games, strolls in the forests, or a bath in the river. Fortunately, Waldensians don't walk alone. I am glad to say that many institutions related to healthcare, education, social assistance, human rights, environmental justice, and advocacy for migrants exist due to ecumenical commitment. Centro Emmanuel, for example, is an agroecological farm and the center for retreats and camps. It wouldn't exist if Lutherans, Methodists, and Waldensians hadn't worked together for so many years. With a low budget, Centro Emmanuel manages to gather, train, and advise ecologic farmers to encourage them to help them sell their production so that they can still live on their small farms. Since I started working there, I rediscovered ecotheology, a branch of theological thinking centered in how human beings relate with nature as part of their spirituality. Members of the ecotheology team are young church leaders who volunteer to organize workshops, retreats, and seminaries. I am glad to say that I had the opportunity to learn from them. There I found new signs of helpfulness. I think that Centro Emmanuel makes a humble contribution to global ethics and human dignity. It is a modest example of a different way of life, far from excessive consumerism, far from the obscene wealth of those who have rotten the earth and poisoned our rivers. Perhaps our work is just a voice that cries out in the desert. Perhaps no one will listen. Perhaps many people think it is worthless, but we'll keep trying. So, to conclude, as we sometimes say jokingly, Waldensians in Rio de la Plata are not Uruguayan, neither Argentinian. Perhaps not everybody, but many of us consider ourselves to be Rioplatenses. Even more than culturally, we're spiritually part of a region that our church and our history created in our hearts. We sometimes joke about our nationality, but the fact is that many of us have built family relations and friendships that pass over national borders. As a former migrant, I can also say that I shared my faith with Argentinian brothers and sisters from the semi-arid Pampas, from Buenos Aires, from Entre Rios. They are part of my identity. From my point of view, being part of a non-national church is a gift. I would like to finish here with a very simple thought. At the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned that during the 19th century, some Waldensians said that they were living in the promised land. Unfortunately, it was not. And sometimes Waldensians even felt like exiles. Many people today in South America still feel like that, lost in a puzzling world of political struggles, pauperization, or social marginality. Perhaps this is not the promised land that our ancestors thought to have found, but we still believe that it could be for everyone someday if the God of history leads our way. Thank you.